Hello everybody, Thersites the Historian here. Today I would like to talk about the Electoral College and its institutional origins. The reason why I want to make this video is because this institution is very important and it has been the subject of much controversy since the year 2000. So I'd like to look at the original reasons for forming the Electoral College and also ask the question of whether or not this institution is still relevant and useful in today's world. As always, when studying any historical phenomenon, the most important thing that you can do early on is to set a proper context for a full understanding of the topic. So the real origin of the Electoral College is in the Constitution, and the Constitution wouldn't exist without the failure of the Articles of Confederation, so I'm going to look at that very briefly. The Articles of Confederation were America's governing documents between 1781 and 1788. The Articles provided for a unicameral national legislature. It was called Congress. It was not divided into a House and Senate. It was just a single body. And the leader of that body was the president. He was just a one guy out of that body who was elected to be the leader. The Articles only provided for a very limited federal power, so the national government was not very influential or powerful. The real shortcoming of the Articles of Confederation is that the national government had no real financial power, and without the ability to raise taxes, there was no way to maintain a standing army. Now, being a new nation, America still had a lot of problems on its frontier, with British garrisons which were supposed to be withdrawn in accordance with the peace treaty from 1783. However, the British were not compelled to withdraw their garrisons because the U.S. could pose no real military threat. There was also a problem with the Barbary pirates around this period, and because the United States did not have the financial wherewithal to invest in or maintain a military, the U.S. looked like easy pickings for all of its more established, more organized neighbors. So, understanding that this problem was one of institutions, a lot of the founding fathers decided to call for a constitutional convention and try to come up with a better national government which would meet the nation's needs. The Constitutional Convention took place between May 25th and September 17th, 1787 in Philadelphia. This was a very hot summer, and of course this is a time before air conditioning. This meeting was kept fairly secretive, and the members were shut indoors, so you can imagine that tempers would have run higher than normal, just like the temperatures were running. What basically the members of the convention were trying to do is completely and totally rethink the U.S. political system from the ground up. Now, a lot of people had preconceived notions going into this. There were actually 4 distinct blueprints for how to organize the nation. I'm not going to get into all of that. If you want to see that, you can find that on your own pretty easily. Just keep in mind, though, there were a wide variety of ideas on how to do just about everything, and that included how to select the executive branch. There also were some ideas about having an executive branch which would not have a single head. But again, if you want to know more about those kind of details, I suggest you do your own research. Another thing to keep in mind is that the Constitutional Convention contained many strong personalities. As I said, there were 4 different people who had come up with their own complete constitutional plans. So this was going to be a long, drawn-out debate between some pretty entrenched people with a lot of self-confidence and a lot of debating skills. If you really want to get inside of the heads of the men at the convention and really understand why they came up with the Electoral College, you first really need to understand what political thought was like during this period, both in terms of immediate needs and guiding principles. And while I don't intend to lay out Enlightenment philosophy at any kind of length, I would just like to just sort of establish some of the basic binary considerations that members of the convention had. So, first and foremost, because of the failure of the Articles of Confederation, there was a lot of debate about national power as opposed to state power. The Articles of Confederation more or less enshrined state power as a very key thing, And while you might think that this would lead to a complete reversal of priorities for most people, that's not necessarily the case, because a lot of states still more or less considered themselves to be independent actors, and a lot of people were not completely sold on the idea of strengthening the national government. There's also an ongoing struggle for representation and power between small and large states, small and large defined by their population, not by their geography. Now, big states tended to like arrangements whereby population determined the degree to which you were represented, whereas small states preferred equality, even if it's an equality which came at the expense of representing each citizen equally. So that was a concern which really shaped these proceedings. Another problem is that slavery had a major impact on the way that population was counted. The South wanted their slaves to be counted as citizens, but not actually be citizens. People in the North who didn't own slaves found that annoying, and they thought that it gave the South more influence than it deserved. So ultimately, of course, that was resolved by the 3/5 compromise, where slaves counted as 3/5 of a person for the purpose of representation. But that was something that had to be really hashed out over the course of the summer of 1787. Now, coming out of the American Revolution, where there was a lot of rhetoric about the tyranny of King George, there was a great deal of fear about the problem of a potential executive tyranny. So there were a lot of people who really wanted to limit the executive, and they were concerned about the probability of a runaway executive. This is further sort of inflamed by the fact that many of the people present at this were people who had served in state legislatures and in Congress before. So they were people who were very much not all that keen on a very powerful executive. There was also the problem of how to peacefully transfer power. A lot of people felt like ambitious politicians would be unwilling to cede power if they were to lose an election or be booted by their peers. So there was a real problem with how to establish legitimacy in a way which would be acceptable to all parties and assuage the rather massive egos of a lot of the sort of aristocratic landowning people who did not know how to take no for an answer. There was also a fear of corruption. The founders were very concerned with making sure that this process was open and equitable to some extent. However, there were other people who, because of their elitist tendencies, didn't want the process to be too open. So that was another line of debate. And finally, there was the idea forming of a government which would exercise checks and balances. So you would have different elements of the government there to check the potential excesses of the other. This also plays back into national versus state power and small versus big states. And this sort of idea of checks and balances was often articulated by some of the big players like James Madison, Thomas Jefferson. A lot of those kind of major thinkers that you can name really sort of talked about the importance of checks and balances. So this is basically, these concerns are basically the ones which really help guide this whole debate over how to choose an executive leader for the United States national government. So now that we have a very basic understanding of the philosophical underpinnings of this debate, let's just go through the debate as it developed. Now, early on, there was some debate over how many executives you would need. Edmund Randolph of Virginia proposed that you should have an unstated number of people with an unstated terms who would be chosen by Congress. So his basic proposal was just let the national legislature decide who the executives would be. It's a little bit vague, and I think that was one of the reasons why other delegates might have been uneasy with it. It was a little unformed and unclear. Charles Pinckney from South Carolina wanted to have a single executive, i.e. one president, but he didn't really do much to specify how this person would be elected or what the length of his term would be. Early on, it looked like the convention wanted to keep up the way that the Articles of Confederation had functioned and allow the national legislature to pick the executive. The states voted 8-2 to allow that to happen. And by the way, I don't understand exactly why a lot of these votes did not include all 13 states. Sometimes I guess the members would either abstain or they weren't present for whatever reason. So keep in mind that these numbers will not always add up to the same number, just for those of you paying attention to details. One of the first potential solutions for resolving this dilemma about how to choose an executive came from James Wilson of Pennsylvania, who later became a Supreme Court justice. Wilson's idea was to let the people choose the executive so that it would be as independent from the states and the state governments as possible. What he wanted to do was to create districts and states which went along the lines of the districts for the national legislature and allow those districts to choose special electors who would then go on to choose the executive. The limitation on the electors to prevent them from colluding and disrupting the process is that they could not choose one of their own number, and they served no other purpose. What he was thinking was that this proposal would be a compromise between having a popular election where the people directly elect a leader and allowing the national legislature to choose. And he thought that this method would be the one which would inspire the most overall public confidence and really enable an executive to have a sense of legitimacy. Of course, this is basically the proposal for the Electoral College as we know it, and this idea would be revisited in due time, although for the moment it was not accepted and it was shot down in favor of an election by the national legislature, which would be the dominant idea for most of the Constitutional Convention. A rival proposal came from Elbridge Gerry of Massachusetts. Now, like I said earlier, a lot of the people at the convention wanted to maintain state supremacy over the federal government, and Gerry was one of those. Now, Gerry said that electing the executive by the national legislature would be a mistake because this would make it too prone to corruption and intrigue, since the executive would be beholden to the people who elected him. And he wanted the states to have that prerogative. So his idea was to allow state governors, who would each receive the voting power equivalent to the representation in the national legislature, which I assume at this point was based on population and not on pure equality, that went back and forth over the course of the convention. And they would have that voting power and then use their respective votes to choose an executive. He said that this proposal would have merit because what it does is it really lessens the executive's dependence on the legislature. Gerry famously was the 5th vice president under James Monroe, and he was vice president at a time of increasing party partisanship, and he is the father of the practice of gerrymandering, which used to be called gerrymandering after the way that his name is pronounced. However, Gerry's plan did not really settle well with many of the other delegates. Edmund Randolph immediately tore into it, and his argument was basically that state governors wouldn't be able to communicate effectively with each other and that the election process would end up being chaotic. And he said more or less that because of the inequality between the state governors, which would be enshrined in this process, small states would effectively have no chance of putting one of their own number in the chief executive office. As I said earlier, small states were very concerned about preserving their ability to influence national affairs, and they didn't want large states like Virginia and Pennsylvania controlling everything. And Randolph also pointed out that Gerry's scheme would make the presidents too beholden to state prerogatives, and that they wouldn't promote the interest of the nation, because he thought that it was important for state officials to promote the power of the state and for national officials to promote the power of the national government. So he effectively pointed out those flaws in Gerry's argument, and Gerry's plan ultimately was defeated 10-1, so it didn't go so well. The only reason why I included this part is just to show the power of the small versus large state debate in these proceedings. Earlier in the video, I alluded to there having been 4 major plans which were brought to the Constitutional Convention. One of those plans was William Patterson's New Jersey plan, in which, among other things, he proposed having a direct election of the executive by the people. Patterson's proposal failed 9-1, and there was a great deal of opposition to having a direct popular election. We'll get more into the reasons for that later. Also, this is Patterson pictured on your screen when he was later put on the Supreme Court. Those are his justice robes. There was also another proposal that was put out where the state legislatures would choose electors, but that failed 8-2. So that was sort of a variation on Elbridge's idea of having governors choose, but instead it would go to state legislatures. But still, the basic principle of really empowering the states was at play. And there was another idea that was carried unanimously where the national legislature would be the body which decided who the executive was. That, of course, as I mentioned earlier, was how the Articles of Confederation did things. So this was sort of the default fallback position. And normally when people are in doubt and an issue is thorny, they sort of stick with what they know. And because of that, the issue seemed decided, and the convention, or at least most of the people there, were ready to move on. And it seemed like, this was a cut and dried thing. This hard-fought and unanimously agreed upon consensus that the national legislature should elect the executive fell apart in a mere 2 days. Just 2 days after that consensus was reached, the debate was reopened because the convention was debating on term limits for executives, and they were debating on whether an executive should be eligible for re-election, how long he could serve, and because of that, people like James Wilson started to think that if a president can serve twice, it might not be a good idea to allow them to be chosen by the national legislature, since that might just mean that presidents would almost be guaranteed 2 terms. So this was a debate, and just as now, as you see from this billboard, term limits are a continual issue in American politics, and it is just as controversial and debated as the Electoral College. However, this is not about term limits as such, so we're going to move on. Now that the issue of how to elect the executive had been reopened, James Madison decided to enter the fray. Madison was from Virginia. He points out that if you really want to have 3 branches of government which exercise power separately, then it's important that they gain their power by independent means so that they're not beholden to one another. So it's by that standard, you can't have an executive which is chosen by and beholden to the legislature. So therefore, this old consensus of having the national legislature choose the executive was unacceptable. He thinks ideally the source of power for the executive should be the people in a popular election, but because the popular election was problematic, he decided to go with electors. That would enable them to avoid the problem of, how you count slaves for representation. And while Madison does concede that his solution of having an electoral college would favor big states and penalize the southern states by not giving them full credit for all of the slaves they own, he saw this as the best overall compromise when you consider all interest. His proposal had an effect on people, but it was not carried, so the debate wore on. So while Madison was in favor of a popular vote, and there were a couple other people who were like-minded, the popular vote was not a popular idea among the delegates at the Constitutional Convention. So let's look at why that is before we move any further into what happened at the convention. So why did so many of the delegates at the Constitutional Convention so vehemently oppose the idea of having a popular vote for president? George Mason from Virginia and Elbridge Gerry from Massachusetts were among the 2 most prominent men who really railed against the idea of having a popular election because they thought that the masses were dumb and that they would fall prey to demagoguery. Where did they get that idea? Well, the classics, at least as it was practiced in their age, really emphasized the idea that democracy was completely evil. Now, you have to understand that the sources that they draw on for ancient history, people like the Greek historian Thucydides, were all upper class, they were aristocrats, and their own personal interests were contrary to the interest of the populace at large, and they tended to despise common people who could get together and vote for their own interest rather than allowing aristocrats to do what they wanted. So ancient sources are very biased against democracy, and it's only through really reading the classics in a contextual way that you can see some of the more positive aspects of, say, Athenian democracy. And by the way, many of the founders were fond of Rome, but almost all of them were fearful of following the example of Athens because of people like Thucydides, who more or less portrayed it as a city which got misled by vicious demagogues who took advantage of stupid people. And it's also worth keeping in mind, in case you had forgotten for some reason, that the founding fathers were extremely wealthy. Most of these men owned either fairly large businesses by the standards of the day, or they were large slave owners in the South. So they had a sense of elitism that led them to believe that the average man was not terribly well informed and didn't really deserve much of a say. Early in the Constitution, and until the time of Andrew Jackson, there was a property requirement for voting. So while it is true that only white men could vote in America in the early days, what is often forgotten is that you had to be a white man who owned at least a minimum amount of property. So that meant that in the early stages of American history, less than 10% of the population was eligible to vote. So this was a deeply entrenched prejudice of this time, and the men who were at the Constitutional Convention very much reflected that prejudice against people who lacked property, education, and a pedigree. So keep that in mind. This is why these delegates are so vehemently opposed to the popular vote, at least the delegates who aren't named James Madison. So, back to the action at the convention. The delegates were getting weary by early August, and they had finally put together a draft of the Constitution. However, there were still a few kinks in it, and one of those bigger kinks was the problem of what you do if the two houses of Congress disagree on who the president should be. So, Gouverneur Morris from Pennsylvania proposed that if there's a split in Congress, then at that point you have electors, and the electors break the tie. But that proposal stalled when there was a 4-4 vote on it. So what the convention attendees decided to do was choose a Grand Committee of 11 and have them iron out all these undecided issues, and then they would come back later and decide if the committee had come up with a satisfactory compromise. Since this whole time the idea of the national legislature choosing the president had been so prominent, the Grand Committee decided to kind of work that idea into what became the Electoral College. So rather than the Electoral College following strictly the congressional districts for the House, instead each state would get as many electors as their total for House and Senate members. So each state automatically had 2 senators, and then you had your House members based on population. So the bare minimum for electoral votes that any state can get is 3. If you have a tiny population, and so you get 1 House rep, and then you have 2 senators. Now, this was more acceptable than most of the proposals before that, and most of the opposition against this compromise was surrounding this idea that most of the time this would result in a hang-up, and then the Senate just as a body would end up having to resolve the election. And I have no idea who came up with this, but it sounds like might be a bit of a delay tactic. Anyway, Governor Morris managed to step in and shoot this down by arguing that electors would act in the nation's best interest, and that what they would do is reward good incumbents and remove bad ones and prevent things from going to the Senate. Also, because of this a big objection about things going to the Senate, any kind of failure that took place in the Electoral College would be sent to the House of Representatives, which of course is more democratically elected. Keep in mind the Senate at this time had members who were appointed by state governors, and the House is elected more democratically by district. So it was considered to be a more fair process and a more direct representation of the popular will. This scheme was carried by 9-2. Only the Carolinas objected, but this, of course, is our modern Electoral College, which we still have to this day. So that is how it came to be. Now let's talk about the implications of the Electoral College and whether it still is as useful today as it was when it was first developed. So based on what we've just discussed, let's really try to reflect on the issue of whether the Electoral College is something which is still worth keeping. Now, as I mentioned, the Electoral College was a political compromise in the summer of 1787. It was an institution formed to serve a very specific purpose at a very specific time for very specific reasons. Which means that as times have changed, we have to really analyze whether this institution still meets our needs the way that it met the needs of our forefathers in 1787. The problem for the Electoral College is that it's predicated upon problems which no longer exist. While small states would be angry, for instance, if we took away the 2 senators per state rule and went with, say, 3 senators for big states, 2 for medium-sized states, and 1 for small states, as some people proposed, then it would revitalize that whole issue of small versus large states. But how many times do we see that debate really take place in today's world? Also, you may have noticed, slavery is no longer a thing. So we don't have to worry about the 3/5 compromise and worry about how to count people who are also property when it comes to representation. Furthermore, as we've discussed, a lot of the main social and political assumptions that went into forming the Electoral College, namely the idea that common people are not worthy of a vote, are no longer mainstream. Everyone can vote now as long as you're an adult and a citizen, and you don't have a felony conviction hanging over you. There aren't really very many restrictions. Women can vote now. Obviously, freed black people who their ancestors were slaves, they can vote. So many of these sort of assumptions have gone out the window. And we also live in a time where we've seen the political elite of our own time make major mistakes in judgment. Does anybody honestly believe that these people are infallible? Does anyone believe that their few numbers really possess more wisdom than everyone else put together? It just doesn't seem all that likely, especially now that we live in an age where many people have college degrees, when almost everyone has access to the internet and they can fact check on their own. So this whole idea that we need to insulate the state from people chosen by the will of the people, this idea is outdated. It's not something that many people support anymore. So the question becomes, why support an institution which really enshrines that? At heart, the Electoral College is a fundamentally elitist institution. It reflects the values of the people who created it, and their values simply are not the values of modern Americans. So, for my part, I'm in full favor of abolishing the Electoral College and going to a direct popular vote. But what do you think? And how does your understanding of the origins of the Electoral College influence your opinion on this issue? Let me know in the comments below. I'm Thersites the Historian, and stay tuned for more content in the near future.